Welcome back to Bloodstained Backstories. I'm your host, Jace, and today we're diving into one of the most chilling and twisted cases in American criminal history. The story of Dean Corll, better known as the Candyman, and the horrors of the Houston mass murders. This isn't just the story of unspeakable violence. It's a case that would later be studied by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, shaping the techniques that would become the foundation of modern criminal profiling. Between 1970 and 1973, Dean Corll abducted, raped, tortured, and murdered at least 29 young men and boys in Houston and Pasadena, Texas. He didn't act alone, though. He had two accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. The name Candyman, or Pied Piper as he would sometimes be called, came from a dark irony. Corll and his family once owned a candy factory in Houston Heights, and he was known to hand out free sweets to local children. But behind the seemingly friendly smile was a predator whose crimes would shock a city and haunt investigators for decades. In August 1973, it all came to a violent end when Elmer Wayne Henley shot Corll, but the horror left behind, the bodies, the secrets, and the lives stolen would cement this story as one of the most infamous serial murder cases in U.S. history. Before we dive into the crimes, let's rewind a bit. Dean Corll was born on December 24, 1939 in Fort Wayne, Indiana. His parents, Mary and Arnold Corll, had a turbulent marriage, often marked by arguments and separations. Dean was described as quiet, polite, and well-mannered, but he was socially withdrawn. He grew up in a strict household and was known for being protective of his younger brother Stanley. When the family moved to Vidor, Texas, Dean's mother started a small candy company called Pecan Prince, where Dean worked as a teenager. He was reportedly meticulous about cleanliness and order, traits that would later carry over into the crimes he would commit. After graduating high school in 1958, Dean briefly moved to Indiana. On August 10, 1964, Dean was drafted into the Army. He was assigned to Fort Polk, Louisiana during basic training, and once complete, he was assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia to train as a radio repairman before he was permanently assigned to Fort Hood, Texas. According to official military records, his record of service was unblemished, but Dean hated every bit of military service. He applied for a hardship discharge on the grounds that he was needed in his family's business, and on July 11, 1965, the Army granted his request and gave him an honorable discharge after just 10 months of service. He returned to Houston to help his mother run a new candy business, the Candy Corll Company, as the company's vice president. This is where his reputation as the friendly neighborhood Candyman began. But beneath the image, people close to him described Dean as cold and controlling. Some employees even noticed that he showed an unusual interest in teenage boys who hung around the factory. Dean lured his victims by promising them to take to a party or a ride to one of the addresses he lived at. He used either his Ford Econoline van or a 1969 Chevy Corvette to pick up his victims. The victims would be restrained by force or deception and strangled or shot with a .22 caliber pistol. 18 of the victims were buried by Dean and his accomplices in a boat shed he rented. 4 were buried in Woodland near Lake Sam Rayburn. 1 victim was buried at the beach house in Jefferson County, and at least 6 were buried in Bolivar Peninsula. In 1967, Dean befriended David Owen Brooks, a 12-year-old 6th grade student and one of the many children he gave free candy to. At the rear of his family's candy factory, David had bought a pool table, and many of the young men that worked there would gather after work. He told David that he would give him $200 for every boy he could convince to come back to his apartment. On September 25, 1970, Jeffrey Conan would become the first victim. He He was approximately 18-year-old and a college freshman. At 6:15 p.m., he was dropped off at Westminster Road and South Boss Road by a friend from the University of Texas that he had been hitchhiking with. David Brooks took police to the body on August 10, 1963 at Highland Beach. Forensic scientists concluded that he had died of asphyxiation and strangled with a gag cloth in his mouth. The body was found covered in lime, wrapped in plastic, and bound with nylon cord at the hands and feet. James Glass and Danny Yates were the next victims on December 13, 1970. David Brooks lured them from a religious rally in Houston Heights to Dean's Yorktown apartment. James was an acquaintance of David's and had been to the apartment before. The boys were tied to opposite ends of Dean's torture board, raped, strangled, and buried in the boat shed. An electrical cord with alligator clips attached to each end was buried next to Danny's body, likely part of his torture. Donald and Jerry Waldron would be the next victims on January 30th, 1971. The brothers were walking home, and they had been dropped off at a friend's house by their father so they could discuss forming a bowling league, but the friend was not at home. They were brought to Dean's apartment, raped, strangled, and buried in the boat shed. On March 9, 1971, Randall Harvey would fall prey to this cult. He was just 15 years old and last seen riding his bike toward Oak Forest, where he worked as a gas station attendant. He was killed by a single gunshot to the head. On May 29, 1971, David Hillgrist and Gregory Mallory were the next victims of this trio. David was just 13 years old and Gregory was 16. They were both murdered at the apartment on West 11th Street. Elmer helped to hang up missing and reward posters for David Hillgrist, as they had been lifelong friends. I don't know if I would consider them friends after that. I don't know about you, but I don't lower my friends to a death. On July 1st, 1971, Donald Falcon was up next. He was 17-year-old and partially found at the boat shed. It took until 2014 to identify him with the help of forensic anthropologists from University of North Texas Science Center, and DNA evidence would be pivotal in identifying his body, or the partial body that was found. On August 4th, 1971, another acquaintance of David, Reuben Watson, would be next. He was 17 years old. Reuben was walking home from the movie theater in Houston, and David convinced him to attend a party at Dean's San Felipe Street house. Reuben was strangled and then buried in the boat shed. Starting to see a pattern with friends of David's, they all end up dead. On August 17, 1971, Mark Scott falls prey as a 17-year-old. He was chosen by Dean to be the next victim because he cheated on a deal relating to stolen property. He fought furiously and attempted to stab Dean, but Elmer held a pistol to him, and he gave up. June 4th, 1972, Billy Lawrence is next. He was 15 years old, and this time he was a friend of Elmer's. He was tortured for several days and strangled, and then was buried at Lake St. Rayburn. Billy Bosch and Johnny DeLome were next on May 21st, 1972. They were walking to the store together. Billy was a former employee at the Corll Candy Company, and Johnny was shot in the head and a bullet exited through his ear. He pleaded with Dean, and Elmer strangled him. Their bodies were discovered at High Island Beach. December 20th, 1972, victim 15 comes along, and that is Stephen Sickman. He was seen leaving a party and then was strangled and buried at High Island Beach. Then the killing stopped for a little while and resumed in the summer. On July 25th, 1972, Roy Button was abducted while walking to his job at the Houston shoe store. He was gagged with a section of Turkish towel and his mouth was bound with adhesive tape. He was buried at the boat shed. Wayne Simino and Richard Hembry were next up on November 15, 1972. Wally was 14 years old and Richard was 13. They were enticed by Dean's fancy Corvette. While abducted, Jay called his mom, and she heard shouting the name Mama being called before the phone was disconnected. Elmer would accidentally shoot Richard in the mouth, and the bullet would exit through his neck. Both boys were strangled and buried in a common grave at the boat shed. On November 26, 1972, Willard Branch, an 18-year-old, disappeared while hitchhiking from Mount Pleasant to Houston. He was also buried in the boat shed. March 7, 1973, Richard Kemper disappeared on his way to a phone booth. He was just 19 years old and was strangled and buried at High Island Beach. On February 1st, 1973, Joseph Lyles, who happened to live on the same street as David Brooks, was abducted. He was 17-year-old, and his body would remain unidentified until November of 2009, when DNA evidence could identify the body. Then on March 7th, 1973, Richard Kempner disappeared while on his way to a phone booth. He was strangled and buried at High Island Beach. Then the murders stopped for a time. Up until June of 1973, there were no new murders. Dean suffered from hydrocele in early 1973, and Elmer traveled to Florida with a long-haul truck driver uncle before temporarily relocating to Mount Pleasant. When Dean would resume the killings, the raid night at a friend's house, the 15-year-old would be shot and left to bleed out in Dean's bathtub, only to be buried at Lake St. Rayburn. And then John Sellers, whose exact death date is not known, but was sometime in July of 1973, was kidnapped, bound and shot, and buried at High Island Beach. In July 1973, family who had already had grief and been victim of Dean's torture would be tortured again, as Michael Bosch, who was the younger brother of Billy Bosch, was abducted under the pretense of getting a haircut. He was strangled and buried at Lake St. Rayburn and wouldn't be identified until 2010. Charles Coble and Marty Ray Jones were next on July 25, 1973. Charles was just 17 and Marty was 18. 2 days after their abduction, both families received a phone call from their son demanding to be paid $1,000. The ransom was never paid, and the boys were never returned. Elmer shot Charles in the right temple, and both boys were buried in the boat shed. August 3, 1973 brings James Stanton Draymola, who was 13 years old. He was riding his bike in Pasadena and driven to Lamar Avenue under the pretense of collecting empty glass bottles to resell. He would spend only 45 minutes at Dean's place before being attacked and killed. His body was buried at Lake St. Rayburn. On August 7, 1973, our story takes a violent turn. Timothy Cordell Kearley, who was a casual acquaintance of Dean, and likely the attendant victim. They sniffed paint fumes and drank alcohol until midnight, and Elmer and Timothy left around midnight and parked close to Elmer's house. They exited the vehicle because they heard a commotion across from the street, and it was 15-year-old Rhonda Louise Williams, who had sprained her ankle after being beaten by her drunken father. All three of them would get into the car and drove to Dean's house and arrived around 3 a.m. And when they did, Dean would be furious that a girl was brought over. Everything was ruined. They drank, smoked marijuana, and sniffed paint fumes, and they passed out. 2 hours later, Elmer awoke to be on his stomach, and Dean was putting handcuffs on his wrists. His mouth taped shut and his ankles were bound. Next to him was Timothy and Rhonda, and they were bound with nylon rope and gagged with adhesive tape. Timothy had been stripped naked. When Dean noticed Elmer was waking up, he removed the gag from his mouth, and Elmer protested against Dean's actions, and Dean reiterated he was angry at him for bringing a girl to the house, and that he was going to kill all three of them after he tortured and assaulted Timothy. Dean stated things such as, "Man, you blew it. You brought a girl to this house. I'm going to kill all of you. But first, I'm going to have my fun." He then kicked Rhonda in the chest repeatedly before putting a transistor radio between her and Timothy and turning the volume up as high as it can go. Dean lifted Elmer to his feet and dragged him to the kitchen and placed a .22 caliber pistol against his stomach, threatening to shoot him. Elmer was able to calm down Dean and promised to participate in the torture and murder of Timothy and Rhonda if Dean would release him. After about 30 minutes of discussion, Dean would agree and untie Elmer. They then carried Timothy and Rhonda to the bedroom and tied them to opposite ends of the torture board, Timothy on his stomach, Rhonda on her back. Dean gave Elmer a hunting knife and ordered him to cut off Rhonda's clothes, insisting that he would rape and kill Timothy, and Elmer would do the same for Rhonda. Elmer began to cut away Rhonda's clothes, and Dean undressed and began to assault and torture Timothy. Elmer asked Dean if he could take Rhonda to another room. Dean ignored him, and Elmer grabbed a pistol, shouting, "You've gone far enough, Dean. I can't take it any longer. I can't let you kill my friends anymore." Dean approached and stepped back, and Dean continued to press him and saying things like, "You won't do it." Well, he did. Elmer then fired a shot at Dean, hitting him in the forehead. The bullet did not fully penetrate Dean's skull, and he continued to move forward. Elmer would fire 2 more shots, hitting Dean in the left shoulder. Dean ran out of the room, and Elmer fired 3 additional shots, hitting him in the lower back and shoulder. He slid down the wall in the hallway outside the room where the 2 teenagers were. At 8:24 on August 8th, 1973, Elmer called the Pasadena Police Department. When operator Velmer Lyons answered, Elmer blurted out, "Y'all better come right now, I just killed a man." He gave the operator the address, and the Pasadena Police Department arrived moments later. Officer David Mullican was the first on the scene, followed by Officer Gary Savage and Detective Sergeant Bruce Snowden. When they arrived, Elmer met them outside and said, "I had to do it. I couldn't let him kill those kids." When officers entered the house, they found Dean's body laying on his back near a wall, and a .22 caliber Ruger pistol near his body, handcuffs, nylon rope, plastic bags and duct tape, and of course, the infamous torture board. At the Pasadena Police Department, Elmer confessed, stating, "Dean killed them, and I buried them." Elmer would lead investigators to the boat shed. And Elmer was charged with 6 murders and received 6 life sentences. Elmer would be charged with 6 murders and receive 6 life sentences. David would be sentenced to life imprisonment after being found guilty of Billy Lawrence's murder. The story of Dean Corll reminds us that evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces and that darkness lurks sometimes where we least expect it. It is also a testament to courage, to the bravery of those who spoke up, those who investigated, and those who refused to stay silent in the face of unspeakable horror. Thanks for joining us on Bloodstained Backstories. If you were captivated, horrified, or simply compelled to learn more, be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and follow us across all social media platforms. Links are in the description below. Until next time, stay vigilant, keep your eyes open, and remember, every story leaves a mark.